Hello everyone. In this brief video, I want to try to answer all the main questions that students have about the final essay for POLS 2044. So let's go ahead and jump in. I've downloaded the questions from the online survey that I asked all students to complete. I've ranked them by the number of upvotes, and so starting from the top, could we please have some more details on how to run a significance test or a t-test? Yes, you may. I tried to cover them all in detail in the lectures. You're more than welcome to go back to the lecture recordings to look through all of them. It really does depend on what type of hypothesis test you're trying to run. And I also have included in the writing guide, which I'm going to go through in a second, talking about all the different tests that we've run. So a significance test depends on if you're running a correlation, difference of means test, multivariate regression. All of those involve different types of tests, although the underlying intuition should hopefully be the same for all of them. So I would say go back to the lectures, go back to the lecture notes, in the writing guide that I have as well. There are innumerable sources on the web and in YouTube for any specific test if you want it explained potentially in a different way, written form. There are open source statistics textbooks as well as the ones that are recommended at the end of the course guide. So I encourage you to take a look at those. And if you're not sure where to start, you're always welcome to let Ernest, Mark, or I know, and we can try to give you some more specific recommendations depending on your research question and your approach. Next question is, when do we use a one-tailed test and when do we use a two-tailed test when using the t-statistic? I deal with this in the writing guide in more detail in a second, but the short answer now is it depends on whether your hypothesis has an underlying directionality. Are you arguing that as x goes up, y will go down? Or are you just hypothesizing that x will just have some effect on y, but you're not sure which direction it may go? Usually you would use a second tail test for when you're not sure about what the directionality of the relationship is, and a one tail test if you do have a direction. However, in practice, most people do use a two tail test because it is a bit more conservative and a bit more easy for readers to interpret. So for this essay, I would recommend just using a two-tailed test, though if you have a p-value of between 0.05 and 0.1, where you would otherwise reject your alternate hypothesis and say you fail to reject your null hypothesis, then and you think that you're running a substantial risk of a false negative or type 2 error, then that's when I would recommend using a one-tailed test. There's happy to talk to any of you if you have any specific questions about your specific case, or if when you're trying to interpret those p-values if they are in that range. The third question, are we supposed to get a raw data set and perform the statistical analysis on the data using something like Excel? Or are we merely using someone else's data? If the latter, are we allowed to do the former? Hopefully you're getting data from published reputable sources, either from replication data, from somebody's article that is quite close to what you're doing, but you want to analyze it in a different way, or if you're looking at basic relationships between main kinds of variables like life expectancy, democracy score, economic development, then you can go get those data yourselves from varieties of democracy, World Bank, or other direct sources, and then merge them together in your own analysis. So it really does depend on your question and what data are out there. Are they in a easily available format like the quality of governance indicators in which everything is all merged together, or varieties of democracy that has 400 variables testing a whole bunch of different things? Or are you going to need to grab things from different sources to answer your particular question? It really does depend on what you want to do, but yes, you should be analyzing with a statistical software. It doesn't matter which one you use. You can use Excel, you can use SPSS, R, Python, Stata, whichever one. The basic mathematics that all these different programs are running are comparable and they should give you the same results. So I'm agnostic about what platform you use. The goal is that you can use the methods, understand what you're doing, and understanding how to interpret the results. Okay. The next question, what exactly do we need to talk about in the data analysis section? I'm confused on what else we're supposed to say, apart from describing the data and saying whether it supports or doesn't support a hypothesis. Yes, you should describe the data both substantively as well as practically, and you should use a method to be able to evaluate the hypothesis that you have and decide whether it supports or does not support the hypothesis. However, the important thing to also do is take that next step to analyze what the results mean and connecting it back to your research question and your argument. The scientific method is circular, and once you have the results, you have to reflect on those results in light of your argument. So it's not just running the test, but understanding the meaning that it has for the argument and your question that you asked earlier in your essay, as well as a deal with how robust your results might be to alternate specifications, different assumptions, or including different control variables. Next question, is a literature review supposed to include just the methods literature or the broad literature on the topic? The literature review is focused on the substance related to your research question and the argument they're trying to make. I haven't heard of any students just focusing on a methodological question, although that would be really interesting to read. So then the literature would reflect the ways previous researchers have tried to answer your research question or something similar to it. So it should focus on the substance on the topic. Next question, can I run a Pearson's R test on my data instead of a student's t-test? Not quite sure I understand whether you're just basically talking about the correlation coefficient without then turning and evaluating whether it's statistically significant. I think you need to do both with all of these methods that we've talked about and that you've done practice examples of in tutorial. You are both generating that statistic and then evaluating whether that statistic is statistically significant or not. So you have to do both. Both generate the statistic and then evaluate whether it's statistically significant. Are we allowed to reuse parts of our qualitative essay and put it directly into our final essay? Yes. I mean, it shouldn't be 90% the same thing because the methodological focus is different. But as I've said in lecture, in the course guide, and one-on-one with students, it is fine to reuse elements of your research question, your literature, your argument, because we've tried to design the assessment so that they all build on each other and that you're just looking at the same question, the same argument, but from different methodological lenses and different approaches. So yes, you can reuse text as long as you are adding something new for this final assessment. What is this, my grade? What's the difference between C, D, and HD in terms of the final essay? How can I maximize my grade? In the guide, I have the rubric in the course guide, the links to it. I also have the links in Waddle as well. I've also put them in my final essay guidance paper, which I'm going to get to in a second. But the takeaways are that you really are able to think. You have a clear research question, creative and interesting argument that you're trying to make, an explicit null and alternate hypothesis. You have clear methods that demonstrates that you have understood the assumptions and the purpose of the specific methods, how you can interpret the results and connect it back to your underlying argument and hypothesis that shows also creativity, clear structure, editing, and is an engaging read. You'll have more details in the course rubric. Let me know if you have any questions about that. Is it okay to use only two variables? Yeah, if you really can't think of any potential alternate explanation for your outcome besides the main one then you're focusing on, I would like to hear what that outcome is. I think in social science, as we've talked about in this class, there are myriad potential causes for any particular effect. But if your limitations are more methodological, then you could do a correlation coefficient or do a bivariate regression, interpret them correctly, and then talk about the limitations of your approach, the risks of the pitfalls that we discussed in week 11 for the class, and think about what you would want to do if you had more time or more training to be able to include further analyses. So it's not just discussing the methods that you are able to do, but show that you understand what else is out there, what you would be able to do, or what alternate challenges to concluding the relationship that you're focusing on. So you can, but hopefully there's enough around it to be able to show that you have a sophisticated understanding of your topic as well as the methodological approaches that are available to you. Okay, what is this? Should the essay be structured as a traditional essay or like a journal? Intro, literature review, methodological results, discussion, and conclusion. I go over this in the written guide, but I would say the latter. I mean, the body, paragraphs, and arguments. I'm not sure how that structure would work as a traditional essay. Maybe you come from a different major that I'm not familiar with, but usually the argument would come as part of the body paragraphs, or hopefully before the paragraphs discussing the explanations for your outcome. But I would try to model it on the research essays that we cover in this class or that are relevant to your particular topic. Is there a recommended proportion or word count of the paper for the literature review to take up? I would say less is more. I've had a number of essays and problem statements in this class that have focused far too much on the literature and not enough on the students' work. So I would say try to focus on only enough of the literature to paint that background so that you can have your main argument and evidence in the foreground. This is not a literature review. You're not just supposed to have one paragraph for each article and summarize it, which I've sadly seen in a number of essays. The goal is to kind of say, okay, I'm trying to explain how do natural resources lead to civil war? And there's, in this literature, there's three themes or three causal factors that can explain civil war: greed, grievance, and opportunity. And natural resources can affect greed, it can affect grievance, and it can affect opportunity. And here are the ways in which they can do that. My argument really focuses on opportunity, and here's how I conceptualize that and how it relates to civil war, yada yada. And so you can have a brief background painting of the main themes that the literature has already talked about relative to your outcome, but the goal should be on your argument and your evidence. With only 3,000 words, you really want to make sure that your points and your essay comes first instead of just summarizing others' work. Can we use first person? Short answer is yes. Of course, as with everything, in moderation. The goal is to try to write as clearly and directly as possible to try to make sure your readers can understand what you're trying to make, the point that you're trying to make. And by using passive tense or using this essay, we'll discuss, it uses 7 words for something in just saying, I posit, I argue, I believe that, so forth and so on. So it's often more direct to use first person, which you will have seen in the published research for this class. So far, the last question, the explanation of which statistical test for hypothesis testing is appropriate has focused on combinations of categorical or continuous variables. Will this be expanded to include other variables such as interval or ratio? I have an interval independent variable and a continuous dependent variable. Usually, and that table that I had in the lecture for a couple of weeks should hopefully be helpful with that. You can go back to the notes to find them there, but often the kind of, for correlation coefficients, requires 2 continuous variables. For interval independent variables, then that would lead towards bivariate or multivariate regression. With a continuous dependent variable, and if your interval one was just two categories, then you could just do a difference of means test. But usually regression is where most people end up. And in the guide, I go over in more detail I answer to that, which kind of leads me to that now. So this video was delayed for a little bit because of other academic responsibilities, sick children, and I was just getting a lot of questions in and talking to a lot of students. So I also have written what is now a 3,709 word final essay guide that I will put on Waddle and email to you when I share this video. And I go through basically what I've addressed to these few questions, but hopefully a lot more as well. I go through from talking about what to look for in a title, how to structure your introduction in a paint by numbers kind of format, because I do think that most introductions to political science research papers have a similar structure. Don't want to try to make any of this a mystery, and you can learn a lot by just copying or adapting the format of what other people have done in the past. And so I give a blow by blow from talking about what other previous research has found, why we should care about it, why it's important, what the literature has missed or doesn't pay adequate attention for what you think is important, what your causal mechanism is, your research question, the empirical implications and what your models are going to include, a brief hint about what you find later on in the essay, and then what is likely to follow. So you want to have it try as clear a structure as possible. Talk about the research question, the literature review and argument section, how you could combine the two, end with an observable hypothesis, the research design, how to find the data if you have trouble finding the data. I've had a few students email authors directly, which usually is something I only recommend for graduate students. And if you have trouble finding data, you're more than welcome to send me an email. I like going on data treasure hunts. Don't want to speak for the tutors, but I often think that this is where hopefully you would have done it for the revised problem statement to try to get all these data collection issues out of the way. But with only 2 weeks to go, we want to try to figure out what you can do that's feasible with the time that you have available. Descriptive statistics, which we spent a whole week on, and we've talked about that in subsequent weeks, what you might want to include and why it could be helpful to try to understand how you're connecting concept to measurement. Control variables, your sample, try to keep your sample reasonable. I would say how many observations, recommend between 30 and 250. You want to make sure you have enough degrees of freedom for a relatively small sample, but you don't want to get something completely intractable. A pooled cross-sectional time series design with 4,000 observations that you've never had to try to clean before, don't understand how the error structures are, that you might have to cluster them, which is something that's outside the scope of this class. So you want to try to just do something concrete and reasonable with the time that we have. I talk about hypothesis tests and the different methods for evaluating them. And if you're looking for the answers to particular hypothesis tests, as the question mentioned earlier, I have, there's one question about critical p-values. I found a video through this Math and Science YouTube channel, which will link you to other recommended sources. Just do a keyword search for a particular method you're trying to learn about, and there's a lot of channels out there. Most of them aren't in the social sciences, but the basic intuition behind hypothesis testing and t-tests and p-values are comparable. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to answer all of those kind of questions individually, so there's a lot of resources there I try to put in here. I talked about when to use 1 and 2 tail tests. I include a paragraph there. Talked about interval and ratio variables, like I just talked about there. How to talk about the results and conduct any robustness checks to make sure that your one regression is not an outlier, what other things could be affecting your outcome. Ways you might want to think about multi-method approach to include a case study or part of the case study that you had for your qualitative essay in the final essay. We're going to be talking more about that in week 12, and then some basic structure recommendations. I also included a summary of the rubric from the honors guide to make it easier for you to find, talking about the summary. Is there a clear research question? an argument? Does it critically engage with a relevant intellectual tradition, appropriate literature and sources, a clear research design, relevant theory and methodology? Is the evidence and data collected and used effectively? Are you using the persuasive methods and description of it? Is there clear evidence of writing and revision? And is it appropriate citations? It is important that you cite the sources for any direct quotes or the ideas that you get for your paper, and give them adequate credit. We want to make sure to avoid any academic mistakes there. And then here's the guide for the different percentage marks for that question of trying to how to do an HD. Engage with the course, do the lectures, show up to tutorial, understand the methods, really have a creative and interesting research project, and carry it off well is the short answer for an HD, which basically might not be that satisfactory, but there aren't any kind of direct shortcuts to that. If you have any specific questions about your particular case, do let me know. And then a bibliography. Include one. Make sure that it's organized consistently and formatted consistently. Make sure you have page numbers in your essays. No large amounts of missing space. Have clear section headers like I did in the writing guide here. And leave yourself enough time to actually read over it repeatedly to try to make sure that the essay, that's what also can really bump up an essay, is a couple of rounds of editing and really trying to show your argument and evidence in the clearest light possible. So with that, I'm losing my voice. It's the end of another long but fun day. So I will post this 3,007 word guide on Waddle. You have a lot of resources. I tried to provide as many resources as I can on Waddle. If you have any questions, I have office hours in person in week 12 between 1 and 3 on Thursdays, always available via email, and before and after the final lecture on Monday. So with that, thank you all for a great semester, for watching this video. If there's anything that I missed, feel free to let the tutors or me know, and I look forward to reading what you guys come up with. Thank you for your time.